We'll have our go ahead and call the meeting to order. Now I'm seeing on my is this correct agenda? October 18th, right? No. All right, now I got the right agenda for me. Excuse me. So if we can go ahead and call the meeting order at 10 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get into the first item. Do we have a quorum? Or I see Vanessa there, and I'm not seeing.
We have mayor.
What other members do we have here?
Three.
Three? Okay. And I see Michael's up first. Rule 1111.
Great. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Mike Krause, Planning and Rules Manager. I'm here to present an update on proposed amended Rule 1111, NOx emissions from natural gas-fired van-type central furnaces. Okay. So by way of background, during our last board meeting on November 1st, there was concerns raised by our folks up in the San Bernardino Mountains. These are installers of furnaces up there, basically high altitude in the high altitude areas. Concerns were raised whether there was enough availability of the new compliant furnaces, as well as if there was not, there could be potential public health and safety issues. So we're here to propose some amendments to that rule in order to allow some additional time for manufacturers of the furnaces to go ahead and test and develop the necessary kits and guidances in order to operate these furnaces in high altitude areas. Just by a way of background, however, so everyone knows, during this whole interim, when the last compliance final date came on board at October 1st, we did have some enforcement discretion, as well as interim product variances, I'll get to in a moment here, that were in place so to ensure there wasn't a gap in any of these areas to stay warm. Okay, for those possibly not familiar with Rule 1111, we have regulated furnaces in our region for around 40 years. Back in the late 70s, we established a standard at 40 nanograms, that's of nitrogen oxides per joule of basically useful heat that's delivered to a heated space. Those limits were on the books for about 30 years until new technology, as we would expect over time, came into play, and we required then a 14 nanograms per joule. In order to give assurances to the public as well as to manufacturers, we did a technology assessment at that time over those years. The conclusion was that those 14 nanograms per joule furnaces were feasible. The following year, in 2014, when the furnaces needed to be in place or start to be sold, the manufacturers came to us and seeking some additional compliance time, which we did provide. We also added in a mitigation fee to encourage those manufacturers to accelerate that deployment. When we got to that time frame in 2018, they again asked for another extension, which we provided, and revisited the mitigation fee as well. We also came back to the stationary source and the board just earlier this year, and to ensure and remind everyone that the final compliance date in October 1st, 2019 was coming up and approaching, and we got the board's support. In the interim, we kept monthly calls with the manufacturers, monitoring their progress. So to focus more on the high altitude and to bring it into perspective, about the second week of September, so we're talking 3 weeks before this final compliance date, we were made aware of a concern that there weren't any available compliant units. So staff went to the manufacturers to confirm that claim. They were correct. There was no compliant high altitude furnaces at that time. However, some of the manufacturers did say they were in the midst of testing or planning to test, so it wasn't like that area was being ignored. However, this was a concern for staff, seeing what a short time frame it was until that final compliance date. So we've decided to provide enforcement discretion to that particular area. We sent out advisory notices to that, we had meetings. We also established a form by which we could check that those that were being sold, the 40 nanograms per joule units, were actually truly being installed in high altitude. And this is just a common practice to ensure it's properly implemented. We also discussed with the manufacturers about product variances. Legally, those variances need to be submitted by those manufacturers. So we wanted to make them not just aware of it, pointing them in the right direction, but also encouraging if that was what was needed. Come the first week of October, at this point then, we had the form in place. We were approving those forms, and furnaces were being installed in the high altitude area. And again, working to assure there was no gap. With regard to the product variances, the status of those, we placed out here. Actually, it's been an update since we posted this. Johnson Controls has now been granted an interim variance as well. So of the 7 manufacturers of furnaces, 4 of them are currently operating under product variance for this particular area. The 3 remaining manufacturers have not taken any action on variances. We'd like to report that none of those manufacturers were part of the requests that we received in the high altitude area during the enforcement discretion period. So Supervisor Rutherford, whose area she represents, took a leadership role in representing those folks. And I think that's why she raised the issue at the board meeting, but also encouraged a meeting which took place with staff and those high altitude installers, for the lack of a better terminology for them. They discussed implementation issues about the product variance as well as the proposed rule. The comments were made from the language that we had come up with by the time we had that meeting on the 7th. So we're really talking a short window here between the 1st and the 7th here. That the proposal that staff had at 4,500 foot elevation should be changed to consider the fact that some areas up in the high altitude area, okay, once you reach that high altitude area, that ledge up there, some of those areas vary in elevation. For example, Crestline could actually go as low as 4,200. And even though manufacturers will have compliant units in theory for that elevation level, it's a real challenge for those installers up there to make that differentiation between you're at 4,200, I go a couple blocks away, you're at 45. So we understood that, we recognized that, we sympathized that, we changed the current proposal to 4,200 feet. We also thought it would be a good idea at this point then to report back to the stationary source with where we're at with these high altitude furnaces and their kits and their testing and all that stuff, as well as weather odds, because we're looking to the future. This rule doesn't end with just these condensing and non-condensing furnaces. There's another due date that's going to come up soon enough. And although this 3rd bullet says we will issue, we actually have already issued that advisory. And not just to the distributors, we went ahead and did a broad net to make sure everyone was aware and on board. Okay, if you're asking a question of, so what's the difference then? You've got product variances out there, and now you're proposing a rule. So we wanted just to show you a very simple matrix of the differences. So in the case of the rule, for example, the applicability would be for all furnace manufacturers, while the variance would just apply to those that were granted a product variance. When it comes to supply chain, it's applicable to the supply chain across the board. Meaning, if you recall, this is a rule that regulates on the manufacturer end, the distributor end, the seller, as well as the installer. So we wanted to make sure that all was not adversely impacted. When it comes to the elevation, we just discussed the 4,200, while the variances were at 4,500. Little footnote on some differentiation there. Don't want to dive into it, but there are some other differences there with the 5,000. Okay. Mitigation fee, there'll be no mitigation fee for the rule, but there will be under the variance. The duration for the rule we're proposing until October 1st, so that would be exactly 1 year from the last final compliance date. The relief on the variances do vary with the manufacturers, but we noticed that when they testified, it was somewhere between a February and a September timeframe. And both would require record keeping. Okay, when we talk about these high altitude, I think I touched on it already, that they have to be tested. There's guidances that are created. Sometimes there's kits that are created depending upon the manufacturer and the equipment. This kits could be hardware, software, things like that. But just to remind everyone, when we're talking about these units, they're not reinventing the actual unit. These are the same units that are being operated in the low basin region. They just need some tweaking. And again, an update here. Now we're talking about 4 manufacturers who have tested and granted variances. So what are we recommending? We would like to amend the rule in December to allow all manufacturers to sell those non-compliant units in the high altitude areas until October 1st, 2020. We'd also require a series of just record keeping, this is not reporting, record keeping, to manufacturers, distributors, and installers, because each have a different role to play. And then finally, we propose a wording in the resolution to direct staff to report back again to the stationary source of the development of high altitude and the weatherized units. Public process, yesterday we had our workshop. And we got some good feedback. We also are going to be having a local public consultation meeting next week with Lake Arrowhead. That was, I believe, a suggestion from Supervisor Rutherford. I think it's a good suggestion. And we'll be up there next week with those folks. And then we're right now in the public comment period. I know it's tight, but that's what happens when we move quickly on these things. And then finally, a public hearing in December. So that concludes my presentation.
Very good. I don't see any speakers at any locations, but maybe we have any there at CC8 on this item?
We
Or?
have speakers.
I
We have a
believe so.
number. Yeah.
Oh, very good. All right. We'll go ahead and call them up then.
First speaker is Angus Lemon. Approach the dais.
Man, only a few of those are for number one.
My name is Angus Lemon. I'm with Ingersoll Rand. I've got 3 quick points to make. First, we fully support the rules amendment as written for altitudes above 4,200 feet. Second point, hybrid heat dual fuel technology is capable of achieving a 90% NOx reduction, greater than the Rule 1111 requirement of 65% reduction, and is currently available from all major OEMs and functions at all altitudes. If we cannot include dual fuel in time for the December 6th rules amendment, we requested this committee require the staff to set up working group meetings with OEMs on the use of hybrid heat dual fuel technology as an alternative compliance method to Rule 1111. If Ingersoll Rand submits that dual fuel technology should be considered as an alternate path of compliance, this would be a practical and permanent solution. Dual fuel is simply the combination of an electric heat pump and a furnace, where the furnace is only used when the heat pump cannot meet the heat load demands of the home. An average furnace in the district would operate only 17 hours per year in the dual fuel system, which would result in approximately a 90% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions compared to a 40 nanogram per joule low NOx furnace. Third and finally, I'd like to address the fact that we are less than 1 year away from the Rule 1111 deadline for package units, and we are not aware of any commercially available ultra-low NOx package units on the market. Package units are currently available in dual fuel configurations that would be compliant with Rule 1111 if the rule was amended to permit the technology. If we start addressing these issues with package units right away, we can avoid being in this situation we're in today at the same time next year with package units. In closing, Ingersoll Rand is supportive of the amendment for furnace applications above 4,200 feet and is supportive of all methods of reducing nitrous oxides and other pollutants in the district, and believes that both ultra-low NOx furnaces as well as dual fuel systems would meet the goals of Rule 1111. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comment. And the next commenter is Mark Woodruff.
I'd like to weigh mine.
Okay, you're both the same company. Yeah, okay. So that's it from here for public comment, Chairman.
Okay. Did staff have a response or a thought on those
Sure.
comments?
Sure. So for the dual fuel, just to remind everyone what they're discussing. So it is true it's dual. So you have this electric pump. However, they're also talking about a furnace that's at the non-compliant 40 nanograms per joule level. Okay. So this would be something that we would need to actually analyze and determine those impacts on there. For example, how each other is controlled. Now I understand that sure, of course, if you run the electric more than you run the non-compliant, that you could see some positive numbers, but we need to kind of get a better understanding of that, and that would take a little bit of time to kind of understand how that works. But also to remind everybody that there are OEMs, we're aware of at least one of those, if not more, that have those dual fuel systems, but on the furnace side, they're of compliant furnace, so at 14 nanograms, also matched up with the electric pump. So we think that we want to hear that side of that story as well before we kind of make these kind of decisions. And also to remember that an amendment thus would take an analysis as well as a public process. So we wouldn't recommend that at the amendment at this time.
Very good. Members? Board members? Any comments?
I don't have any comments. Yeah, I think that staff worked out a pretty good resolution on this, and it was obvious that there was a necessity to do something. So, and it seems that everybody's on board with it, right? All our manufacturers, installers.
We had a public workshop yesterday, and there was positive comment and support for the amendment. And we incorporated all the various different comments that they had made.
The public
No additional comments for me.
Okay.
Chairman, I want to raise one issue about the commenter mentioned something about package.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
I think it's the weatherized.
I had the same question. Go ahead.
I'm not sure that phraseology. Angus, are you talking about weatherized?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, the weatherized units, the compliance date is October 1st, 2020. And so we have a report back to the station area, not only on the high altitude furnaces, but we'll come back and also talk about the weatherized furnaces in May to see to get a pulse on that. And we're very aware now on the importance of the high altitude, so the questions we'll be asking the manufacturer team. Not only for at elevation and at sea level, but, above in the
That's our
upper
schedule,
elevations also.
Okay.
Lessons learned. And I would just like to commend staff. I know this was something that came out sort of a little bit of left field, and I think the actions taken and the swiftness of staff to get on this when it was raised is very commendable. So thank you for working so hard to get this done. And I know it was a little difficult. So thank you.
You bet. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to note too that 1111 is still on the rulemaking calendar for 2020. And as Susan said, we'll be able to come back and make any adjustments and recommendations and review in the meantime. But as you noted, this was a very rapid effort on behalf of staff to address the concerns expressed by those above 4,200 feet.
Well, it's very well appreciated. And also in Riverside County as well, over in Idlewild. And so I know it's not just one area, but multiples, and it's a needed thing. All right, with that, we'll go on to item number 2, the update on proposed Rule 1480. Susan.
Fortunately, we're going to have Jillian, and Susan is going to observe. So Jillian Long.
That's a lot of
And support.
pressure.
Yeah. No pressure.
Good morning, my name is Jillian Wong, Planning and Rules Manager, and I'm here to give you an update on proposed Rule 1480. So by way of background, proposed Rule 1480 is an ambient monitoring and sampling rule for metal toxic air contaminants for facilities that meet specific criteria and have been designated a metal tech monitoring facility. If you remember back when we did the proposed amendments to Rule 1469, there were requests from community representatives to include ambient monitoring and sampling, and that's what 1480 achieves. You heard at the November 1st set hearing comments from representatives from the Metal Finishing Association of Southern California that we're continuing to work through some of the issues that they had, and that we're trying to include reasonable rule provisions without undue cost to facilities, but also maintaining our core provisions of 1480. There were comments about the artificial cost savings, where even though we require only one monitor, facilities would choose to have more than one. And there were concerns about the substantial cost to smaller facilities. And there was a request that we return to this committee to give you an update prior to our public hearing. So as a reminder, here's a general approach to 1480. When we realize or when we identify an issue area, Southwest AQMD would conduct the ambient monitoring and sampling, trying to figure out if there are elevated levels that are found, where are the sources at the facility, and the sources within that facility. Based on those investigative results, then through 1480, we would go through a process to potentially designate a facility. However, if we're unable to designate the facility, we may continue monitoring and sampling. Here's an overview of the requirements of 1480. As I described, first we have a process to designate a facility. Once a facility is designated, then the responsibility of continuing the monitoring and sampling shifts from us to that facility. At a minimum, they start with one monitor and a frequency of a 1 in 3 day sampling schedule. If they meet certain criteria, they're eligible to then reduce that sampling schedule to a 1 in 6 day or reduce the number of monitors. And finally, once they have fully implemented their 1402 risk reduction plan, then they can cease monitoring completely. The rule also has provisions whereby if there are elevated concentrations that are found, they would have to notify us, and we can then do further investigations if we so choose. So our rule development process, it's been a public process, 11 working group meetings. We received 8 comment letters. There have been 6 revisions to rule language, and we had 1 public workshop where notices were distributed to more than 20,000 facilities and or individuals. So here this slide gives you an overview of all of the key issues that were addressed through the rulemaking process. I want to highlight just a few of these, and the big one is on the cost. We have, as I said, reduce all the costs by more than 50% while still maintaining our core provisions. We have included provisions that will acknowledge emissions reductions that will be realized either through voluntary measures that these facilities might choose to undertake or through compliance with existing rules that might have future compliance dates. We also have provisions that recognize that there might be other sources affecting the monitoring results, and there is a clear exit pathway for the facilities from conducting monitoring and sampling. This slide gives you an overview of the reduction in those monitoring and sampling costs from where we started and then to where we are today. A few points to note is that this is for a hexavalent chromium monitor when the costs are significantly higher than if they were to do multi-metals. These are also our fees that we would charge if the facility chooses to have South Coast AQMD continue to do the monitoring and sampling for them. If they were to elect a third-party contractor, we anticipate that those costs would be much lower than our costs. So a couple key issues that you heard at set hearing. The first one was that there was an artificial cost savings by only requiring one monitor, that just because we have one, facilities will likely want two. Based on our experience, what they're talking about is an upwind versus a downwind monitor. And that is very useful in the investigative stages when we're trying to figure out where the sources are, either at whether the facility is a source or the sources within the facility. All of that information is done by us. By the time we get through the designation process and after we designate the facility, we really only focus on that one downwind monitor. The rule also has provisions that if the facility does not have the upwind monitor, they can still provide us with other evidence about activities that are happening in the vicinity of the facility that might be contributing to any kind of a high downwind monitor result. And the other issue you heard was the high cost of small facilities, a concern that these costs would be too burdensome to the small facilities, causing them to either shut down or to leave the basin and operate somewhere else. And what we did then in response to that was added an exemption for the facilities that are independently owned and operated, have 3 million or less in gross receipts averaged over 3 years, and have 25 or fewer employees. They're exempt from all provisions of 1480 except two. One is that initial notice. Now that is the heads up that we would provide a facility that we're conducting monitoring and sampling in the area. At that point, the facility would then have the ability to provide us with information that they meet the criteria that we have listed. The other is a information request provision, and that just asks for information regarding the sources at the facility and also access to do on-site monitoring. Both these provisions are at no cost to the facility. So with that, we are scheduled to take proposed rule 1480 back to the full board for consideration at the December 6th meeting. And that ends my presentation, and I can answer any questions.
And Susan's proud.
I hope so.
Yeah. We all are.
How'd you do, Susan?
Excellent.
Very good. All right, do we have any comment cards?
There are, no, they're over here. Jerry Desmond.
Unless there's any.
There
Go ahead.
are two comment cards. Jerry Desmond.
Okay.
It's first.
Sure, members, Jerry Desmond with the Metal Finishing Association of Southern California. We're at the set hearing. We appreciate the effort that's been made subsequent to that hearing. Had rapid and frequent conversations to develop the language that Ms. Wong just talked about today. And with that, the concerns that we have raised are resolved with the draft as it's before you as you prepare for the December 6th hearing. The combination of the addressing the small facilities and the costs and taking care of them, but also the other issues that have been resolved in recent drafts in terms of benchmark concentration methodology, providing for acknowledgement of other sources, and an exit ramp for those to get out of the process are all very helpful. So we do not have concerns at this point as you move forward, and we appreciate the dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The other commenter is Lawrence Gauribian. Lawrence.
Hello, happy to be here today. I have attended several of the working group meetings and also the workshop on this rule. And I do have some comments, but the first comment is good for the Air District for tackling this really challenging, difficult subject, working so hard on it. One of the things that is important is that there be a continuing dialogue with the other environmental agencies that also have a role in regulating metal finishing shops. I attended recently a meeting of the Regional Water Quality Control Board where they discussed the work that they're doing with metal finishers on this issue. Also DTSC/the CUPA, because this is work that is within their regulatory responsibilities. And recently a discussion with the Department of Public Health, which leads to my second comment about my concern about how priorities will be set for addressing the facilities that come under the purview of this rule, feeling somewhat frustrated that there does not appear to be readily available information on how many of these companies there are, how many of the companies are located near sensitive receptors, and also was interested in a set of information that would be asked of the companies that are told that they may require air emission monitoring equipment, the size of the company, how many buildings they have, what the volume of use of the chemical is, etc. And also the fact that this rule does address metal recycling facilities and metal shredding facilities. I recently commented on some work that DTSC is doing on companies that shred appliances and vehicles. And one of my comments was that they do need to work with the Air District to determine the level of air emissions that are coming from those operations and also from the metal recycling industry. The other thing that I think would be tremendously helpful to everyone, because it's been confusing to me to understand what happens in the various rules that are out there on the books, with a comment that Rule 1469 is certainly a tremendously helpful rule in reducing emissions at these facilities, but other rules the district has also come into play, like the rule that requires a risk prevention plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you. And that's all the cards I have here. No one else wants to speak.
Very good.
on the subject matter? No, okay.
Board member comments, questions, concerns?
Chairman, let me just touch on one thing that Florence raised, and that is, I know when the Paramount situation came up, there were a number of these facilities that we didn't know about, and Florence raised that issue again. How are we addressing that? They all need permits, but are we gradually inventorying all the ones that we know exist and keeping a record of that?
So we've actually, I would say, initiated a number of different programs. The inventory is certainly one of those aspects, but in my mind, I think one of the greater, I'll call it accomplishment, is the development of our mobile monitoring. And I can tell you that's something that we're utilizing now in communities. We're using that in conjunction with the 617 communities, but we're able to rapidly screen. And I can say that there was a recent example where we were getting initial high hits from mobile screening that caused us to go in and do additional screening, which showed us that what was initially perhaps concern wasn't a concern. And so having the analytical capabilities to go and do rapid screening and then follow up with more quantitative analysis is allowing us to more quickly go through all of those various types of programs. It's a lot of work. We're going to continue to do so, but I think that we have the means actually better than any district I'm aware of in the United States or the world for that matter. it can go in and look at these kind of analysis.
Okay, good. Sounds like we're making some headway along those lines, and that was a big concern in the beginning. So there's no more comments here. I have no further comments.
Senator Delgado or Supervisor?
No further comments.
Okay. All right, very good. We're glad to hear we're had a lot of forward progress on this one, and happy to hear with all the accomplishments as far as where we're at today and going into the rule. So that's great. All right, item number 3, the update on the implementation rule 1469.
Good morning, Chairman, committee members. I'm Jason Aspel, Senior Enforcement Manager in the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. This morning I will be presenting to you a status update on the implementation of Rule 1469. Giving a quick background of the rule, it applies to any facility that has a chromic acid anodizing tank or chromium electroplating tank. The third amendment to this rule was the most expansive and now includes other associated tanks in the process line. The rule does reduce hexavalent chromium emissions through various requirements, including work practice, enclosure, and emission limit requirements. There is now a new tiered system which is based on the hexavalent chromium emission potential of these tanks. There are 109 facilities in the Rule 1469 universe. These are fairly evenly distributed between the 3 facility types: chromic acid anodizers, hard chromium platers, and decorative chrome platers. The permit application deadlines in the rule are dependent on these facility types. Quickly touching on the tiered system and the emission mechanisms that the tiered system was based on is rectification or the introduction of electrical current into the tank, air sparging, which is used to mix the solution by bubbling air through the tank, and also through rulemaking and source testing efforts, hexavalent chromium concentration and temperature were found to be contributing factors for the emission of hexavalent chromium. So these mechanisms were used to establish these tank tiers. All tanks in these facilities are now assigned a tier. The highest emission potential being the tier 3 tanks, which can have rectification and or air sparging or high operating temperatures and high concentrations of hex chrome. The lower tiers, tiers 1 and 2, do not have rectification and sparging. Compliance and enforcement has been focusing on these tier 3 tanks at the outstart of this rule. Going through the timeline, there were several immediate and near-term requirements for the rule. There was fortunate timing of an existing requirement, the ongoing compliance status and emission report, which allowed facilities to evaluate their compliance with the immediate requirements as well as look forward to the upcoming deadlines at the time for permit application deadlines, building enclosure requirements, and source test protocols submittal deadlines. The implementation is going well. Three groups are devoting significant resources to the effort: compliance and enforcement, engineering and permitting, and source test engineering. The effort started out with an internal staff training of inspection staff to ensure there was consistent enforcement and understanding of the rule requirements. Staff has committed to quarterly inspections of 1469 facilities, and 100% of those inspections have been completed thus far in 2019. There's been a sharp increase of issuance of notices to comply. Those have doubled as inspectors are out confirming that facilities are complying with the requirements or asking for information regarding the new requirements. The counts in those notices complied have increased tenfold as compared to the previous year prior to the amendment. Notices of violation have also increased from 2 to 8. However, it should be noted that Only 3 of these notices of violation are for brand new requirements of Rule 1469. There is a slight correction to the footnote. 2 of these facilities had issuance of a notice to comply prior to the notice of violation. The 3rd facility was actually operating under a permit to construct and failed to meet the timeline in that permit. But all 3 facilities were aware of the requirements prior to issuance of the violations. There is an ongoing existing requirement for facility operators to become certified with a compliance class. Staff moved those classes earlier to allow facility operators to come in and learn about the new requirements of the rule. Also, 2 compliance advisors were issued in December 2018 and April 2019. Staff also developed new record-keeping templates to help facilities with the new requirements, as well as working with facilities on labeling of tanks, which is a very important measure in order for staff to determine tiers of tanks. Another important measure is as facilities work through the permitting process for the Tier 3 tanks to install air pollution control, they are required as an interim emission control measure to cover those tanks. Staff has been in the field verifying the proper usage of those tanks. Let's skip the slide here. Engineering and permitting is currently processing 69 pending permit applications for 25 different facilities. 19 of those are the anodizing facilities, which were subject to the very first deadline, the May 2nd deadline of 2019, sorry, May 1st deadline. Should be noted that many of these applications were filed prior to the amendment date to address health risk requirements under Rule 1401 and 1402. Permitting staff is seeing that the permit applications coming in mostly have to do with the associated tanks in the line regarding heating and sparging elements. And where possible, facilities are altering their processes to go down to the lower tier rating in their permits, thus lowering the emission potential for hexchrome. Source test engineering, well, I should expand on that, after a permit to construct is issued, the facility then has a year to install the equipment and demonstrate compliance with the emission limit requirements of the rule through a source test. So source test thus far has received several protocol submittals, and most of those have been completed, allowing facilities to move forward with their source test efforts. The rule does allow for a previously existing source test to be used to demonstrate compliance if it was done after January 2015. The collection efficiency parameters established during those tests are currently being enforced by inspection staff. That is very important so that the system can maintain those same parameters and ensure those emission controls are operating at the same level they were tested at. Some of the early lessons learned during this process is staff found it very resource intensive to communicate with the facilities as they mailed out compliance advisories and explained the requirements. In response to that, staff is currently developing a 1469 subscription list as well as a dedicated email address which will be monitored so facilities can have direct communication with staff regarding any questions, and staff can reach out to the facilities regarding upcoming deadlines or distribute future compliance advisories. Staff is finding in the field that facilities may be actually operating at a lower tier than is allowed by the permit. However, we will be communicating to facilities that in order to lock in the benefits of that lower tier, they will need a permit modification. Also, staff is currently educating facilities on these new collection efficiency measurements and the gauges that will verify those measurements. And this is a focus in the compliance class as well as inspector training. And these items will be included in a third compliance advisory that will be coming up in approximately 1 month. Next steps, staff will continue quarterly inspection and outreach efforts, which will include that third compliance advisory and verify the upcoming deadlines, one of which just passed 2 weeks ago for the hard chrome platers, and another upcoming deadline in 2020. Permitting staff will be issuing permits to construct and staff will be verifying that those source tests are conducted subsequent to the installation of add-on air pollution control. And staff will be going through and verifying that Tier 1 and Tier 2 tanks meet the concentration limits in the rule, as well as verifying maintenance of their building enclosures. So as several investigations are ongoing regarding this rule, staff will continue to investigate and conduct these inspections to verify compliance with the rule. And that concludes my presentation. I can field any questions.
Very good. Do we have speaker cards on this one?
We have two cards.
All right.
We have Jerry Desmond.
Hi, Jerry Desmond again with the Metal Finishing Association of Southern California. And just a couple of comments, and as we're in this stage of 1469, now we're in the compliance. And of course, we support and encourage our member facilities to comply with 1469. And I guess it's just a bit of a report from what we're hearing come out in the field with our own members. And that is, I guess as we anticipated, the costs that they're bearing are quite significant. A couple of well-known higher tier facilities have already spent over $250,000 in order to comply, and we are seeing alterations of processes out there. And what we're afraid we may see is the shakeout as this continues forward is we may see different kinds of plating processes moving out of the district into other areas. We're sorry to see that, but an example is I've got an example of a receipt here on new fees for one facility. $14,000 just 3 weeks ago, plus the control costs, another $150,000, adds up to $200,000. So just giving a little that reality check as we go through this, we were fearing that the costs and what the impact would be as we try to protect, air and protect the quality air, but also encourage manufacturing in an environmentally compliant manner to be here, hoping we don't have bad consequences, but we are fearful of that still.
Would you wait? I want to ask a question. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure. Please go ahead.
I wonder to what extent some of the facilities are looking at using trivalent chromium as opposed to hexavalent, and does that reduce costs?
The question of trivalent chrome, they have been exploring it. There's even one facility that's not in the air district here, but is up in Mid-Valley. That is completely trichrome. And they have been the issue are twofold. If we're talking about mil spec and military specs, those processes haven't caught up, and I think there's engagement with either some other chemicals that might be acceptable to the military community. We haven't heard that nexus happen, but we're encouraged and engaged, and with the district would be pleased to do so. And then the other is just consumer acceptance on decorative chrome. Dec chrome, trichrome, it doesn't meet the consumer satisfaction. I think in some of the rural development processes we've talked, there's been discussion about working on the consumer acceptance of trichrome in terms of the products they have out on the market. So those two are challenges, but it is on the radar, and there are investment in one of our members has that facility in the Mid-Valley and continues to explore it. But then they get into even things with fume suppressants and what they're finding in the fume suppressants, even as they look at the tri. So it's not a complete escape yet.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
We also have Florence Garabian again as a speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Florence.
I'll make this very quick. At the workshop on the 1480 rule, I made a statement that it appears that the best thing for companies to do is to work as hard as they can to reduce their air emissions through the other programs that are already underway in order to avoid the additional costs and efforts that are made if they have to install air pollution control equipment. The second comment I have is that one of the things that I was very concerned about in Rule 1469 was the ability to enforce some of the conditions in the rule. In particular, the effort to enclose buildings, keep the door shut, etc. And I did have one comment from one person in Paramount indicating that he's there, he goes by and looks, and that there are many occasions when the doors are open at these facilities. That seems like a particularly difficult part of the rule to enforce. I'm also curious as to whether there are people in this business that continue to fly beneath the radar and haven't applied for a permit, and if the district has any idea of how many of those companies there might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence. Steph, want to make any comments?
Yeah, I can touch on the doors and enforcing that. Staff does take that into consideration as they approach a shop. They often do surveillance of a facility to look at the doors. That is something in the ongoing compliance status report. They have to identify all of the openings that constitute their 3.5%. So staff does know that going in and can evaluate it. Inspections oftentimes take longer than 2 hours. I know I've been with staff on at least one of them where we've had to point out, during that time is, that's opening, what measures are you taking to make sure that's closed? So facilities have used automatic or timed roll-up doors, signage a lot, and we've also encouraged facilities just to train their staff on their activities to keep these shut. But I encourage if somebody's seeing a door that shouldn't be open, to reach out and file a complaint, and we can go and inspect that. So was
The other aspect was about having an idea about which facilities are there or not there. And I think the outreach that we've been doing to the cities and notifying them of violations, it's getting others to be aware and to help us in identifying that. Bless you.
Bless you.
I think the number is fairly low from what we've seen, but you don't know what you don't know.
Right. So that's all the speakers we have here, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Any other board member questions? Not seeing any. All right. With that, we'll go on to the next item with the recommendation for the PFAS fume suppressants for Rule 1469. Susan?
Morning. So the 1469 that Jason had presented is part of what was the commitment when we had brought forward the amendments to 1469 a year ago. And so that was on the enforcement. And then so another commitment is today in regards to coming back to discuss the status of looking at the chemical fume suppressants. So by way of background, Rule 1469 does allow our smallest facilities with the smallest throughput to use certified chemical fume suppressants. And these chemical fume suppressants, they reduce the surface tension, and facilities can use that in lieu of an air pollution. I don't know what.
Someone needs to mute. It's coming through here very.
Okay,
very
in lieu of air pollution control equipment. And in 2012, EPA had banned a chemical called PFAS in the chemical fume suppressants. In 2015, manufacturers had reformulated the fume suppressants to remove the PFAS. So we currently have 4 recertified fume suppressants or non-PFAS fume suppressants. 3 of them do contain a material called PFAS, which I'll talk about. The 4th one doesn't include PFAS. It uses another material called cocamine. So as we went through the rulemaking process, there was concerns from the environmental community groups in regards to the use of PFAS in these chemical fume suppressants. It's been talked about with EPA, with on a water quality issue also. So we did commit to reevaluate the use of chemical fume suppressants in 1469 and talk about a potential phase out. And so we're here today to provide that update. So by way of background, PFAS is the umbrella for a variety of different chemicals, these long chain fluorine chemicals that they're very stable, persistent in the environment. They're used in a variety of different consumer products. Probably the most well-known is used in firefighting foams. It's been primarily an issue with water quality in drinking water, and OEHA is working on looking at the health risk factors associated with PFAS. So through the 1469 process, we did commit to conduct some emissions testing, and based on that emissions testing, looking at the health effects, that we would then decide whether or not we were going to continue with the certification of these fume suppressants, and if we did, facilities can continue using the fume suppressants, and if we decided not to certify the fume suppressants, facilities would be offered 3 options. One would be to install pollution controls by July 1, 2021. Second option would be that we would have some type of package certification of approved technology that the facilities could use. And the third would be that they phase out use of hexavalent chrome, could use trivalent or any other non-toxic alternative. And they would have till July 2022 to do that. So just to summarize the results of the emissions testing, for the 3 chemical fume suppressants, we tested the chemical fume suppressant that had the highest amount of PFAS. That was the Macuplex chemical fume suppressant. The whole objective here is to look at what is the emissions from the air quality perspective to quantify the amount of emissions that are coming off the tank of the PFAS emissions. And so what we found was the emissions were very small, 0.000775 milligrams per amp hour. And this is consistent with what we see in terms of the use of the chemical fume suppressants. They use about, depending on the size of the tank, but on average 4 gallons per year. We did also look at the 4th fume suppressant that does not use PFAS, just to confirm that there was no PFAS contained, and did a liquid test and did verify that the decolloid fume suppressant, the one that uses the cocamine, does not contain PFAS. So a number of considerations with banning fume suppressants, and that we wanted to discuss was that so we did the emissions testing, and from an air quality perspective, that the emissions potential is very, very low. And but we don't want to discount the concern from other agencies in terms of the concern for water quality. And the chemical fume suppressants are very effective at reducing hexavalent chrome, which is a potent carcinogen, and they can reduce the hexavalent chrome by about 99% without the use of add-on pollution controls. And a ban on chemical fume suppressants for these smaller facilities would require the installation of pollution controls. We have currently 16 facilities that would need pollution controls if we were to ban the chemical fume suppressants. On average, the cost, depending on the tank size, would be about $115,000. Smaller facilities, these are the facilities that have the smaller throughput. They tend to be the smaller facilities. We identified 9 of those 16 facilities that had annual revenues less than $3 million, less than 25 employees, the same cut that we're using in proposed Rule 1480 as the smaller facilities. 5 of those are within the 617 communities. The other consideration is the work that's being done, and we are very cognizant that the water quality issues and the concern from other environmental agencies in regards to PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, the whole gamut. And so we want to be cognizant of those other actions, but there hasn't been action yet. So staff's recommendation is that we want to maintain the certification for the PFAS, but it would just be a delay at this time. We, from an air quality perspective, the emissions are low. We want to see what happens with these other environmental agencies in terms of their actions for PFAS. But in this interim, our thought is to establish an incentive fund for the smaller facilities to help them install the pollution controls. We feel like we're seeing the writing on the wall. We want to help these folks get put on the pollution controls in anticipation that there eventually will be some type of ban or limited use on PFAS. Then as we move forward and we look at this issue, then if we need to ban PFAS, that we're in a good place with these smaller facilities. We also want to continue looking at the non-PFAS chemical fume suppressants. We did talk to some of the users of the non-PFAS chemical fume suppressants. Some were very favorable. However, some that were using the non-PFAS fume suppressant did move into another fume suppressant. They did see some streaking and some issues on quality with the non-PFAS fume suppressant. We are committed to reassess the use of PFAS and would come back That's sort of the incentive for the smaller facilities to move forward if we were to establish this incentive fund. So next steps is that we want to notify the facilities that there would be no change in the certification of fume suppressants, hold a public workshop to gather additional input, and return back to the Stationary Source Committee with more details on an incentive fund and other agencies and their actions, and try to coordinate with CARB and water agencies to see how we can move this thought forward. So that concludes my presentation.
All right. Do we have any comment cards on this one?
There's one speaker here.
All right, unless there's a board member question or comment, we'll go ahead and go to that.
Figure it's me again.
Jerry Desmond.
It's a triple play today. Jerry Desmond with the Metal Finishing Association of Southern California. Just a few comments on PFAS. First is to know that we are engaged, as we talk about other agencies, with the water board as it starts to look at PFAS in drinking water. It's already looked at airports, looked at landfills, and we're engaged now with them directly. And what we're finding is the same as we see in the report in terms of the quantities that are used. Compared to the other uses, we're very small, and it's primarily a water issue, perhaps, and there will be sampling to figure that out. But then secondarily would be, we see in the report the opportunity for the small facilities to perhaps engage and receive funding of some sort to get to the HEPA filters, and the leadership of our association would like to engage on that matter to see. It looks like facilities have been identified. We now know what is being called a small facility from the other rule, and we'd like to engage to see, are those members that we can bring to the table and educate them in a way to be the initial pilot projects to engage, then set the precedent for others. So we are interested in the opportunity. We appreciate it to move forward.
Thank you.
I'd just like to respond is that we definitely would like the help of the Metal Finishing Association if we were to move forward with an incentive. Our experience with working with smaller facilities is gaining that trust and having a facility-to-facility help in terms of kind of developing that would be very helpful. So, yes.
Guidance doesn't allow it yet.
Very good.
Mr. Chairman, I understand
Sure.
that this issue would come back to Stationary Source in 90 days.
That's
That's what you recommend?
yes.
Okay, just clarifying.
One of the comments that maybe we could make in addition to what Susan just talked about was our efforts with regards to AB 716. I'm sorry, 617.
Yeah, so as part of the 617, there is funding and incentive funding for these programs, not just mobile sources, which have been traditional, but stationary sources as well. So CARB is still working on the guidance, but we do think that this could specifically be one of the categories that allows some of that funding to be spent on an incentive program like this. So one of the things we'll do in the 90 days is try to piece together potential sources of funding that can go into this.
Great, and we'll work with Mr. Desmond on that. Okay.
Great. All right, any other board member comments or questions?
None for me.
All right, on to item number 5, the update on the source test review evaluation. Jason.
Hi, good morning, Vice Chair, members of the committee.
Good morning, Jason.
It's my pleasure to report on this working group as part of the Reg 3 resolution that directed staff to work with stakeholders to assess and streamline the source test review, as well as update emissions factors. So for background, there are multiple reasons for source tests. One of the reasons is to, as Jason Aspel commented on before, was to make sure that the conditions are met for the permit to operate. The next reason is for follow-up for compliance. So when equipment is in use, source tests be conducted to make sure that while in operation, that this equipment is maintaining to be within the permit limits. These documents are good for certification of small equipment, such as water boilers and also barbecue igniters. The last reason is for doing annual estimations for the air toxics emissions under AB 2588. And all of these source tests provide technical information for all the above. So as part of the Reg 3 amendment, the direction was to develop a plan in consultation with the working group to set priorities for existing and assist-supported inventory of source tests as part of this rule. And to commit to a process and schedule the expected increase in source test reviews due to the revised toxic fees, and includes reducing the current inventory of source tests and targets for compliance with those reviews. And we're here today to talk about the summary of progress made thus far. And then there was a second part of the resolution was to come back to source test, the Stationary Source Committee in June 2019 for the annual emissions. 2020, sorry, I apologize. So that's a misprint on the slides. It's June 2020. Thank you for the correction. So the EQUATE working group for the emissions quantification and testing evaluation was formed. And we had strong participation from stakeholders, including members from WESPA, Southern California Edison, different sanitation districts, and the Small Business Alliance. What I wanted to mention is that staff was already working on this resolution. We recognized that this was an issue. So we had some plans in development and had some initial work. But what this group allowed us to do is get more input and present some of the challenges and give us impetus to move this plan moving forward to resolve those issues. And we were able to take some of their comments and address them through this working group and proceed now to kind of give this presented plan. So just give you an example of how things are being run right now is that a facility submits their source test. And there's several different purposes, as mentioned before, which are housed in the different divisions. So they're submitting to the separate divisions. So there's no kind of central repository. Facilities are submitting it to one division, what they think is the most appropriate place to do that. Within divisions, there sometimes can be multiple contacts with there to be able to process and process those source test requests. And then eventually they will get down to the source test evaluations group where the source test will then be reviewed on the technical basis, returned back to the forward-facing unit for their processes, and then finally the determination brought back to the facility. The hard part with this model is that there are a lot of challenges, and part of the challenges is that multiple routes for submittal. And that allows for when, for example, when we have multiple points of contact, those contacts may move. Sometimes it may not be the appropriate contact for that purpose, so we have to find the appropriate route internally to kind of figure that out. So that is one of the issues that causes some delay for which there was concern. The other aspect is the accountability. There's limited ability for just from the outside perspective and transparency to be able to verify, okay, where is it in the process? Who do we contact internally to kind of figure out where this source test document is? So that was definitely a challenge. And there was another challenge when there was duplicate submittals for when there's two submittals, trying to track that to say, okay, does it need to be charged again? Where is it in the process? So it was difficult for internally to track down duplicate submittals. And then also it made it difficult to assess the staffing resources. Again, we're looking at concerns of delays. So trying to address staffing resources to be able to address this issue appropriately was a struggle to identify. So we had a couple proposed solutions. I think there's a missing slide here. So we did have a graph as part of this to kind of show this is a summary of proposed solutions. One of it is to implement electronic submittal tracking dashboard and routing system. So this is similar to what our friends in permitting have already established as part of their permit tracking. So we're applying this to the source test routing process. The other aspect was to develop a prioritization. So what was suggested was, look, we have the prioritization chart listed above, which has the highest priority showing the expedited review. And this is for facilities who have paid extra to get a faster turnaround on their source test report. So they paid a little bit more, they get expedited review. The next are the protocols. The reason for the protocols is because we don't want to stop any permits to operate. So we want to make sure that the protocols that they're doing the source test reports are moving along the fastest that they can so that the facilities can move and conduct their business and start those processes. So with the new categories that we're going to suggest are the priority permit inventory, which are those that are that are maybe falling behind in the permit process that we need to give that extra attention to turn around those faster. And then there was concern about the AER source test reports, those that can actually look at the annual emissions values that are based, that the permits are based upon. Then there's the standard priority reports, and then the other reports, such as compliance reports, that are the follow-ups of those operations already in process. And then from there, since with the routing system and the tracking system, it allows us to provide some metrics to allow us to adjust staffing needs as necessary. So this is the concept for what we're moving towards, which is now the facility could have just one place where they can submit the submit all their documentation and requests for, and then in the parallel processing can be done by the units after they've been notified, hey, there's something that needs to be reviewed for this purpose. And if it needs technical review, then the source test group will be notified of a document that needs review, processing back to the forward-facing units to then just give back the results to the facility. So some of the advantages of this is shown in this kind of concept module, where in the beginning of the facility, they'll have an online portal which will kind of let them designate the purpose of the source test report. So rather than trying to figure out, well, who do I need to submit the source test to, it becomes a matter of, well, what's the purpose of my source report? Click on what that purpose is, and then they would be able to just submit their documentation. One comment that we received was, what were the requirements for the different types of source tests? For example, there's different requirements for a compliance source test than it would be for an AER source test. So what are some of those differences? So what we committed to do is on this front portal page is to have these guidelines, so that way when they're submitting it for a certain purpose, they know exactly what needs to go in the protocol or what needs to be part of the report. So they know in front that when they submit it, then they know it's a good submittal, and they have the right tools to be able to do that. Because one of the comments we received was, well, we submit it, we don't hear back that we've gotten everything that we need to submit, or we didn't know that, for an AAR we need a triplicate analysis, so it wasn't in our protocol, so it took time for that feedback to get back. So they'll have it very clear as a guideline to this portal page. And then as the submittal goes through the internal processes, there'll be an external facing dashboard to be able to show that progress, understand who to contact in case it gets stuck in a certain place, and be able to get receipts back to them whenever certain processes are being conducted. So there's a lot of benefits to this that address the challenges that were set in the existing process to reduce the amount of delay to get back these important pieces of information back to the facilities through the source process as well as the prioritization mechanism. So there's a lot of external benefits to that. Internally, also having this tracking system to be able to route between the divisions, to make sure that there's less duplicates, and make sure that the appropriate units are reviewing it for the intended purpose is going to be invaluable for efficiency purposes here. So that will also reduce some of the delay that we've been seeing as part of our existing practice. So some of our next steps is to form the subgroup specifically to gather input on the electronic data portal. We have already received a lot of good input from the working group for incorporation of the forward-facing platform of this portal. The second part is to develop that budget for this portal and implement the development of the portal with our friends from information management. And then this Equate working group is going to continue on to address the updates to the default emissions factors. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Board members, comments, questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Is this going to be a job for Ron Moskowitz?
So yes, we are working hand in hand with his group. In fact, we had a representative from his group give the concept, provide the overview of the test portal to the stakeholders, so we can gather that initial input as they start developing kind of this working plan that then we can present to the subgroup of the Equate.
Mayor, let me just add, it really is a team effort. So just about every representative from all the divisions participated in the the brainstorming of this and the actual refinement of it. So Ron is definitely involved, but so is a lot of other people.
And I was struck by your comparison to our permit process, where we cleaned up a lot of mess in our permitting process by putting things online, streamlining it, straightening it out. So do I understand here that you'll be able to kind of track your application the way you track an Amazon package? With your portal workflow, you put it into this portal, and you can kind of follow where it is.
Yeah.
Right, that was the intent, and that was the feedback that we received from the working group, that, having some of those features to be able to see where it is in the process was going to be helpful.
Sounds like a real improvement.
Absolutely.
I think we're doing some good things here to make it easier for with the people we serve. So thank you for all your work on this. There's no public comment here on this issue, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. One question I had, with permitting, we had a sort of a dashboard set up so we knew where we were at and where we were trying to get to. Have we done that in this regard as far as the level of activity we're at and the time it's taking and where we want to get to?
Yeah, so as far as the dashboard, that is going to be a component of this data portal and submission portal, so that way that progress can be tracked externally as well, as you mentioned.
And we're going to bring that back to the subcommittee as well?
So yes, we'll be coming back in June 2020.
Seems so far away, but it's not.
Yeah, comes pretty fast, right, Chair?
Depends on your perspective.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? Senator Delgado? No?
No, I just want to thank staff for all the work. It sounds like a great improvement.
All right, very good. Okay, with that, we have our 6 written report items, the updates and home rule advisory group and violation penalty summaries. Any questions on any of those? If not, do any of my board members have any other business? And do we have any general public comment?
No, there's none here.
None?
None here.
None here, and I don't see any others. All right, with that, our next meeting will be January 24th, and looking forward to this committee. We'll say Happy New Year. So it'll be a little while.
That's right.
All right, everyone have a great holiday.